Community, from my perspective, is this notion, not simply a place, but it has more to do with relationships. And it has more to do with knowing your role, knowing your responsibilities, knowing the accountability that, that others are holding you to. There's this notion of having a collective identity as well. And I think that what struck me in our time here is seeing the Jews having that identity stripped away from them and struggling when someone else had imposed upon them another narrative.
We started out, one was the ghetto for Jews of Krakow, where the Nazis sequestered and eventually deported the Jewish population. We've heard about the Jewish quarter as well, which is moving farther back in time, is where Jews lived for centuries. We're now in a synagogue. That's a very important synagogue in Krakow. It's actually located within the walls. This synagogue is very important in Poland, especially given the number of synagogues that Poland once had that were deliberately destroyed by the Nazis. This one is at least physically and structurally intact. It's now been converted into a museum, so that's a little bit weird in a sense to see. It has a great deal of importance in terms of the community that no longer exists, in terms of the religious practices of that community, which are no longer obviously performed for the community that doesn't exist, and yet it's such an important institution for preserving a sense of Jewish presence and history in this place.
We are here in the Jewish cemetery in Warsaw today to try to suss out what we can, what life was like for the second largest Jewish community in the world in 1939.
Which look like they're praying, but it's got that
are doing this.
And I still don't understand why of all, I mean, if it's why this exists, like why the Nazis didn't destroy this, and why, I mean, if you're trying to erase the remnants of a culture, I mean, start here.
There's a lot of them just everywhere. It's a really beautiful setting for a cemetery, I think, in the woods. It's unlike anything I've ever seen.
I feel like it would be creepy at night. It's really beautiful now.
A lot of them are demolished too, like you can't even see the names on them at some point, which is sad.
This is Janusz Korczak. The child has the right to love. Quote, love the child, not just your own child. The child has the right to respect. Korczak. Let us demand respect for shining eyes, smooth foreheads, youthful effort and confidence. Why should dulled eyes, a wrinkled brow, untidy gray hair, or tired resignation command greater respect? The child has the right to optimal conditions in which to grow and develop. Korczak. We demand do away with hunger, cold, dampness, stench, overcrowding.
The Jews who were part of the resistance, part of any kind of uprising at that time, they were trying to reestablish themselves. They were trying to assert themselves as those human beings who had existed before this Nazi occupation and before the horror that took place. And that's something that I think for me became very real, having had that experience of touring the ghetto in Warsaw and being here in Krakow.
For me, probably the most emotional part was trying to think about how I would explain that to my young daughter. Just being forced out of your home at somebody else's whim.
We went to the apartment building of the head of the Jewish Council here in Warsaw.
And we discussed the decisions that they were forced to make, one of which being the decision to administer passes, work passes, and who would essentially have the right to live and who would essentially have the right, not have the right to live.
Can we judge them?
And we did an exercise where we had to select a very small certain number of the Jewish population to be saved, if you will, to be provided work permits. And then our role, the educators were put into a role of actually selecting so many of the Jews for this purpose. And you had to think, is it worth it to, how do you pick a life that can be saved? And how do you select someone to go to their death?
The real decision was that they decided not to make a decision. They decided to refuse to give out the passes, which in the end is probably the correct decision morally.
We went to the site of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. That was poignant for me because it shows you that when people need to fight injustice, something unfair, that if they pull together and recognize a common goal, that they can at least try to achieve something, at least try to come together.
After the uprisings, and having the opportunity to see what had happened as a result of people asserting their authority and their humanity, unfortunately, there were those who fell victim just the same. And we had spent some time in Jewish cemeteries, seeing those victims and recognizing that they were human beings. They were individuals who were prematurely snuffed out. They had much to contribute to the community, and yet there were those who had controlled their destinies by their evil desires and their ability to want to control and assume power. From there, we saw some of the ultimate evil in terms of the death camps, Treblinka being the first, then going to Majdanek, and then to Auschwitz 1 and 2. And having the images of the horror and standing in the very places where people had met their deaths was humbling, as well as something that I will never forget, something that has certainly become part of my consciousness. And the responsibility I have as a human being, the responsibility I have as someone who's a citizen of Pittsburgh, is to make sure that that justice is not something that is forgotten.
What was really moving for me at Treblinka was to be there with someone who had experienced the camp in a very personal way. Howard Chandler, who we got to meet and spend some time with, explained what went on in Treblinka, how it had impacted him personally and his family. What was most moving during that ceremony, and it touched me more than I anticipated, was the moment where we walked over to these stones with the names of the towns in Poland as part of the memorial Treblinka. And we walked over to Howard's, where he came from, and he placed a candle and a stone on top of that.
In '64, I thought that it would be a good time in my life to come here, and I was completely unprepared for what I saw.
As I walked down the path heading towards the first barrack, which I found out was a gas chamber, I felt I was pretty prepared for it when I walked into it, yet when I walked into it, the fact that it looked like just a community shower room and what its true purpose was really kind of knocked me over, and it put some feelings into me that were very difficult to deal with.
Well, I made myself walk through the gas chambers and the crematorium, which I knew was going to be difficult. And you know, everything's empty in there now except for the exhibits. But one of the things is that my camera, I have a pretty good camera on my phone, and it had a really hard time focusing, even though it has never given me trouble focusing on like just about anything in any type of light before. I think it was reflecting the way I felt about that atmosphere, was that this is too difficult to process.
It was a beautiful blue sky with puffy white cloud day, and I really felt walking around the camp it should have been a cold, dreary, rainy, bitter, like the bitterness that we were observing.
One of the most difficult things to see was actually the pile of ashes, in which it wasn't all ash, it was a lot of large pieces of bone and human remains that you could still see. And after seeing the ovens, to go and see that pile of ash, I felt empowered to now go back and say, you know, I've seen these things, and to share those photos and those stories with my students.
All Israel, to which we say,
Amen. When we did the memorial service, that's when it all just came crashing down.
The most amazing part of the journey was the ability to travel with a Holocaust survivor. Howard Chandler survived Auschwitz-Birkenau, and he reflected on his story there. That was probably the most powerful moment when he stood in the barracks that he was once interned in and explained the importance of remembering and the importance of sharing his story.
My brother and I and my friends, I said, let's go with the Russian prisoners. So quite a few people from our town survived, if you could outlast difficulties forthcoming.
Auschwitz was hard. The room full of hair was particularly difficult, I think, to witness. We looked at this wall of photos where all the women had had their hair just chopped off, and it wasn't with any sort of care. The biggest book I've ever seen was the Book of Names. I have really thought about identity and anonymity of death in this, and I thought it was really powerful to see the names of everybody, and I love how every name was deliberately like bolded and lit up in the middle, the light that went down the middle, so that every page you turn had light on it.
I think the one thing in visiting the death camps this week that taught me something I didn't know before was how, and for lack of a better word, and I asked several people if they could help me find a better word, but they all seemed comfortable with this, and perhaps it's not right. But the intimacy of these death camps shocked me. How close the prisoners and the guards and everyone within these camps lived together, and how anyone being able to look at another human being so closely, face to face, breath to breath, could do what they did is something I'll never be able to understand.
Memory is very important from the standpoint of being able to grasp the fact that though there was evil intent in the demise of these people, that we are responsible for keeping their memory alive, making sure that others are aware of the potential that they had. There is also the sense that if we do forget, then we are doomed, as George Santana said, we are doomed to repeat the past. So, you know, memory is one of those things that on a continuum of human experience, from my perspective, we want to be able to recognize that there was potential that was not realized in what we have seen this past week, and yet there, for those of us who are still here, there's tremendous potential to keep the memory of those who had been sacrificed alive, so that we can be the kind of society, the kind of human beings that we're called to be, to contribute to a world that is indeed a better place where people can live and experience life to its fullest and can thrive.
Well, this isn't a small town, and I always imagine these villages as having just 2 or 3 or 4 or 500 people, but this is a big area. You know, it reminds me of the suburb that I live in. It's easy to imagine this happening in the place where I live, you know? There's children playing here, there's life happening, there's business happening. You know, this is clearly a central square where people walk and shop and eat. And to imagine that, you know, this was a place of terror and horror, it's really sobering, and that juxtaposition is jarring. This morning we went to a cultural center or theater, and the dignitaries of the town, the mayor of the town, who's called Mr. President, and the leaders of the Polish Forum for Dialogue welcomed us, and especially welcomed Howard Chandler, as Howard really told his story in its entirety to us for the first time.
And today, I'm in front of you, an 88-year-old man. I have come here back to my hometown of Bierznik, now it's called Starachowice, to tell you a little bit about myself. Growing up here, my experiences as a Jewish person living here before and during the years of the war. I am not here because it's an easy thing to do, not an easy thing to do at all, but because of you, students and teachers of this country and those from the United States, so that hopefully you will learn from each other and to tell my experiences to others so we can learn.
Actually, being able to tell your students that you met someone that I heard you speak is so important.
It's still mind-boggling. It's still mind-boggling when you take in the whole picture that the reaction was not what you would imagine it should have been.
The piece that I'm grappling with is this concept of memory, and it's very multi-layered. We saw so many things during this journey, so many haunting images, so many images of horror and terror and intolerance. But of course, through Howard's eyes, we also saw the concept of hope.
It's interesting in world history to learn about this period because it's so unique. It's so unique. It's never happened before. And while it was happening, people in one location didn't want to believe what was taking place in another location if they heard about it. They just didn't believe it. How could it be that you take a civilian, non-violent population and you just do away with them?
We just visited an amazing museum that tries to preserve the memories of the Jews who were killed from this town, this village, that was once inhabited by 1/3 of its population was Jewish pre-World War II and was wiped out during World War II.
All the groups that are here, they're not Jewish. They started it to tell the Jewish story, and they're being funded by the Polish government and other grants and contributions.
You can see the main building on this photo. You saw this building. This is the castle. 1942, Germans liquidated the ghetto. 28,000 Jews were moved to the Belzec camp. So we have a family tree, yes? Here. Portraits, information about date of birth, place of birth, address, children, date of death, about the brothers and sisters.
What I took away from this was that the very fact that there is a museum and that there are young Polish youth that are the new generation that is putting this museum together and working hard to preserve this memory is testimony that that there is hope and that that the current population of this town and this village is different from what it was during World War II.
So the Leaning Menorah in Kielce is the memorial to the Holocaust in that town, and it was really amazing because it's literally just this leaning, piece of art where it's half sunk into the ground or it's rising out of the ground depending on how you look at it. The history is that we started with this life before persecution, and then went into the Holocaust, and then the hope that came after the Holocaust was over. It was a really beautiful, really powerful, it's a very large thing. Our whole group could take a picture around it.
We just heard from a righteous person, someone
certified by Yad Vashem as having assisted in the safety and harboring of Jews. These are extraordinary stories. I read a book once, what is the common denominator among people who are willing to save people? I think Jewish people talk about never again as never again to us. But it's not never again to us, it's never again to anyone.
Celebration is something that I believe is part of the human spirit. There are times when we all have gone through conflict and tragedy, but there's also the hope that burns within us, and there are ways in which we can express that hope, and celebration is one of those ways in which we can express that hope. And I think last night with the Jewish festival, we saw people having, taking the opportunity to embrace that experience, to be able to take whatever they have that's part of that human emotion, that joy, and express it through dancing, through shouting, through connecting with people that they've never seen before, and somehow making that a way in which they can validate each other. And I have to say that it was a great way to end this week.
Last night was amazing. I would really consider it our last night of the trip. We leave very early tomorrow morning. 3 a.m. we're going to be up, taking showers, getting ready to go. So last night was really kind of the piece de resistance of the trip. And being with all of these high school students who are traveling with us and watching them dance with Howard at this amazing concert in downtown Krakow in the middle of the Jewish Quarter on a beautiful night was just amazing. I stood off to the side a bit, not knowing many of these students. Many of the other instructors who are here know these kids personally. And I watched. I was able to observe their interactions with Howard. And the most amazing thing was their comfort with Howard and calling him Uncle Howard and coming up to him and thanking him and then joining him in dancing. And when I saw them in a circle, and several of their teachers as well, dancing and just having the best time, I could not have been more proud to be with this group.
It was a great way to end this week, to know that that at some level we connected in a way. We can keep hope alive, and we can continue to think about a future that is prosperous, that can create a better world.
Thank you, I love you.